I was walking my daughter down the aisle when my ex-husband stood up and shouted that I was a disgrace of a mother. The entire church laughed, but when my daughter grabbed the microphone and revealed why her father wasn't invited, 200 guests went completely silent. My name is Verena, and I'm about to tell you what happened at my daughter's wedding that made the local news and changed our family forever. This isn't just another wedding drama story. This is about the moment my 26-year-old daughter, Hazel, stood up to the man who abandoned her and defended the mother who raised her alone. A beautiful Saturday afternoon in October, St. Michael's Church decorated with white roses and baby's breath, every pew filled with friends and family who'd watched Hazel grow from a broken 11-year-old into a successful pediatric nurse. Her groom, Ashton, was waiting at the altar with tears already streaming down his face. He'd been crying since the doors opened and he saw her in that vintage lace gown that had belonged to my mother. Everything was perfect until Preston showed up. Preston, my ex-husband who hadn't seen Hazel in 3 years. Preston, who left us for his 22-year-old secretary when Hazel was just 11. Preston, who was now standing in the back of the church, drunk, with his third wife, Brinley, clinging to his arm like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The laughter from the guests still haunts me. Not everyone knew our story, you see. Some of Ashton's extended family had never heard about the man who missed every important moment in Hazel's life. They thought maybe this was some kind of joke, some wedding tradition they weren't familiar with. But I knew better. The moment I heard his voice boom across that sacred space, I knew he was here to destroy the one day that was supposed to be purely about Hazel's happiness. My daughter's hand started shaking in mine. Her beautiful bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus trembled like leaves in a storm. 15 years of careful rebuilding, 15 years of therapy and healing and moving forward, and he thought he could just walk in and claim his rights as her father. But here's what Preston didn't know. Hazel wasn't 11 anymore. She wasn't the little girl who used to wait by the window for a father who never came. She was a grown woman who had learned that family isn't about blood or titles. It's about who shows up when life gets hard. When she let go of my arm and walked toward that microphone, I thought my heart would stop. The wedding photographer lowered his camera. The string quartet stopped playing Pachelbel's Canon. Even my mother, who never shows emotion in public, grabbed my brother Colton's hand so tight he would later joke she nearly broke his fingers. "Maybe I should tell you all why Dad wasn't invited," Hazel said, her voice carrying across the hushed church like thunder. What followed was the most powerful 3 minutes I've ever witnessed. My daughter didn't just defend me. That day, she showed everyone in that church what real strength looks like. She proved that sometimes the best response to a bully isn't silence or politeness. Sometimes it's the truth, delivered with the kind of grace that only comes from genuine pain, transformed into wisdom. The man who called me a disgrace stood there while his own daughter listed every birthday, every graduation, every moment he'd chosen himself over her. The guests who had laughed moments before sat frozen in their pews, some crying, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Ashton's father, Jerome, a gentle giant of a man who'd become more of a father to Hazel than Preston ever was, stood up ready to physically remove Preston if necessary. But the most incredible part wasn't Hazel's speech or Preston being escorted out by security. It wasn't even the standing ovation that followed. It was what happened during the father-daughter dance, when my daughter stopped the music and called me onto the floor. "I want to dance with my real parent," she said into the microphone, "the one who never gave up on me." That's the moment I want to tell you about. Not the drama or the confrontation, but the love that came after. The way 200 people watched a mother and daughter dance to 1,000 years and understood that family is what you make it. The way Hazel whispered in my ear that she was pregnant and naming her daughter after me. The way we rebuilt our joy in real time, refusing to let Preston's poison ruin even one more second of our lives. This is that story, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of how we got there. The morning of Hazel's wedding started at 5 a.m. with her jumping on my bed like she was 6 years old again. "Mom, it's happening. I'm getting married today." She was glowing in a way that made every sacrifice of the last 15 years worth it. We lay there for a moment, her head on my shoulder, both of us staring at the wedding dress hanging on the back of the door. "Remember when we used to plan my wedding with paper dolls?" she asked, tracing patterns on the comforter. "You always said I'd wear Grandma's dress." "And here we are," I said, kissing her forehead, "though you're much more beautiful than any paper doll we ever made." The bridal suite at the Marriott downtown was buzzing with activity by 7 a.m. My mother, still spry at 71, was directing traffic like a general preparing for battle. "Delaney, those flowers need to be refrigerated until the last moment," she called to my niece. "Willa, did you bring the blue hairpin for something borrowed?" Willa, Ashton's mother, had become one of my closest friends over the 3 years our kids had been together. She understood single motherhood in a way that made our bond instant and deep. Her husband Jerome had raised Ashton alone after she'd struggled with addiction in his early years. Now, 15 years sober, she was one of the strongest women I knew. "Mom's going to cry before we even get to the church," Hazel announced to the room as the makeup artist worked on her eyes. "Place your bets now, ladies." "I'm not crying," I protested, already feeling my eyes water. "She's crying." Delaney laughed. "Pay up, Hazel," I said before 8 a.m. The truth was, I'd been emotional for weeks. Not sad emotional, but overwhelmed with pride and joy. The little girl who'd sobbed herself to sleep asking why Daddy didn't love us anymore had grown into this confident, compassionate woman. She'd graduated nursing school with honors. She'd found a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. She'd built a life filled with love and purpose. "Tell us the story again, Aunt Verena," Delaney said as she helped Hazel step into the dress, "about how you managed Hazel's college tuition." "Oh, that's not a wedding day story," I deflected, but Hazel grabbed my hand. "Yes, it is," she said firmly. "Every sacrifice you made is part of today's story." So I told them, while the hairstylist created magic with Hazel's long brown hair, how I'd worked 3 jobs for 5 straight years. Days at the department store, evenings cleaning office buildings, weekends catering events. How I'd sold my engagement ring, my grandmother's china, even my car, taking the bus for 2 years to save money. How I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day so Hazel could have proper meals. "You never told me about the car," Hazel said quietly. "You didn't need to know. You needed to focus on school." My brother Colton arrived with his husband Derek at 9 a.m., carrying coffee and pastries from Hazel's favorite bakery. "How's our bride?" Colton asked, then stopped short. "Oh my God, Hazy, you look exactly like Mom did at her wedding." It was true. In my mother's dress, with her hair swept up, Hazel was the image of my mother from the photos we'd all grown up seeing. The same elegant neck, the same graceful posture, the same radiant smile. "Has anyone heard from Preston?" my mother asked quietly, pulling me aside. "No, and we won't," I said firmly. "He wasn't invited." Hazel made that decision herself, and I support it completely. The truth was more complicated. Preston had reached out through his lawyer 2 months ago, demanding to be included. He'd threatened to show up anyway, claiming his paternal rights. Hazel had responded with her own lawyer, reminding him that abandonment and years of unpaid child support didn't grant him any rights to anything. "Good," my mother said. "That man forfeited his right to this day when he walked out on you both." As we prepared to leave for the church, Hazel pulled me into the bathroom for a private moment. "Mom, I need you to know something," she said, gripping both my hands. "Whatever happens today, however perfect or imperfect it is, you've already given me everything. You were both parents. You were everything." "Don't make me cry off my makeup," I laughed through tears. "I'm serious," she continued. "Ashton knows our story. His family knows. Everyone who matters knows that you're the hero of my story, not the victim of Dad's." At 10:30, we loaded into the limos, Hazel in one with her bridesmaids, me in another with my mother and Colton. As we pulled up to St. Michael's, its bells ringing in celebration, I had no idea that in less than an hour, Preston would turn our joy into chaos, and Hazel would transform that chaos into one of the most powerful moments of truth I'd ever witnessed. The church doors opened, and I heard the collective intake of breath from 200 guests. Hazel looked absolutely radiant. The afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows created a halo effect around her veil. I took her arm, feeling her pulse racing through her delicate wrist. "Ready, sweetheart," I whispered. "With you beside me?" "Always," she replied, squeezing my hand. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon, and we took our first steps down the aisle. Ashton stood at the altar, his hand over his heart, tears already flowing freely. His groomsmen, including Hazel's best friend from nursing school, Marcus, were all smiling broadly. The photographer was capturing every moment, moving silently along the side of the church. We were halfway down the aisle, just passing the pew where Ashton's grandmother sat, when the main church doors crashed open behind us. "Stop this charade right now!" The music scratched to a halt. Every single head turned. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the voice I hadn't heard in 3 years. Preston stood there, swaying slightly, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. Beside him, a young woman in a too-tight red dress looked mortified. This must be Brinley, the third wife I'd only heard about through mutual acquaintances. "She shouldn't be walking her down the aisle," Preston shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Verena is a disgrace of a mother. She's the reason I haven't seen my daughter in years. This is parental alienation at its finest." A nervous titter ran through the crowd. Some of Ashton's relatives, the ones who didn't know our history, actually laughed, thinking this might be some kind of bizarre wedding tradition or joke. My face burned with humiliation as I heard someone whisper, "Is this planned?" Preston stumbled forward a few steps, Brinley trying unsuccessfully to hold him back. 15 years, he continued, his voice booming through the sacred space. 15 years of being shut out of my daughter's life because this woman couldn't handle a civilized divorce. "Sir, you need to leave immediately." Jerome stood up, his imposing 6'4" frame blocking the aisle. "I'm not going anywhere," Preston shouted back. "I'm her father. I have more right to be here than any of you people." "Hazel, sweetheart, look at me." Hazel's entire body had gone rigid beside me. I could feel her trembling, her bouquet shaking violently in her hands. The carefully applied mascara was already starting to run as tears pooled in her eyes. "Daddy's here now," Preston continued, his voice taking on a false sweetness that made my stomach turn. "I know your mother has filled your head with lies about me, but I'm here to make things right. On your wedding day, just like I always promised when you were little." "You need to leave now." Ashton had left his position at the altar and was walking toward us, his face dark with anger. "Oh, the groom speaks." Preston laughed bitterly. "Tell me, son, did my ex-wife tell you how she drove me away? How she made my life so miserable I had no choice but to leave? Did she mention the constant nagging, the jealousy, the way she turned my own daughter against me?" That's when I heard it, the murmuring of agreement from some corners of the church. "The father should be here," an elderly woman said. "Family is family." Someone else whispered, "Poor man, missing his daughter's wedding." My mother stood up in the front pew. "Preston Matthews, you abandoned your family. You have no right to be here. Dolores, still defending your daughter's bad behavior, I see," Preston sneered. "No wonder Verena turned out the way she did, poisoning my child against her own father." "Please," Brinley tugged at his arm, speaking for the first time. "Preston, we should go." "Shut up," he snapped at her, and she recoiled. "I'm handling this. Hazel, baby, I'm your dad. I should be the one walking you down this aisle, not this bitter woman who couldn't keep a husband." The church had descended into chaos. The photographer had stopped shooting. The string quartet was packing up their instruments. Several guests were pulling out their phones, and I realized with horror that this was probably being recorded. Colton and Derek had moved to flank Preston, ready to physically remove him if necessary. But Preston wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, waving it in the air. "I have texts," he declared. "Years of texts I sent trying to see my daughter, and this woman blocked me at every turn. She wanted to punish me for finding happiness with someone else." "That's not true," I said quietly, but my voice was drowned out by the commotion. Hazel's hand slipped from mine. She stood there for a moment in the middle of the aisle, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then she straightened her spine, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and turned to face her father with a look that could have cut glass. The entire church held its breath as she began walking, not toward the altar, but toward the podium with the microphone. Hazel's heels clicked against the marble floor with determined precision. Each step echoed through the silent church as 200 guests watched her approach the podium. Her wedding dress train swept behind her like a queen's robe, and despite her smeared makeup, she had never looked more powerful to me. "Hazel, don't do this," Preston called out, his drunk bravado faltering. "We can talk about this. Privately, sweetie. This doesn't need to be public." She gripped the microphone with both hands, her engagement ring catching the light from the stained glass windows. For a moment, she just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces, some confused, some sympathetic, some recording on their phones. Then she spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Everyone, please sit down. Since my father has decided to crash my wedding and make accusations about my mother, you should all know the truth about why Preston Matthews wasn't invited today." "Hazel, stop being dramatic," Preston slurred, but Jerome and Colton had positioned themselves between him and the altar, creating a human wall. "Dramatic?" Hazel's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You want to talk about dramatic, Dad? How about dramatically abandoning your 11-year-old daughter to run off with someone barely older than your niece?" Brinley's face went scarlet. She tried again to pull Preston toward the door, but he shook her off violently. "Let me paint you all a picture," Hazel continued, her voice gaining strength. "When I was 11 years old, my father came home from a business trip and told my mother he was in love with his secretary. Not just leaving, but in love. He'd been having an affair for 2 years while my mom was at home raising me, supporting his career, being the perfect corporate wife. I watched my daughter transform before my eyes. The shaking girl from moments ago had become a warrior, armed with truth and 15 years of suppressed pain. But that's not even the worst part," she said, gripping the podium now. "Dad, do you remember what you said to me that night when I begged you not to leave?" Preston's face had gone pale. "Hazel, that was years ago. We don't need to rehash ancient history. You told me I'd understand when I was older. That sometimes daddies need to be happy too, and that your happiness was with Stephanie. You said you'd see me every weekend, that nothing would really change except you'd have 2 houses to love me from." Ashton had moved closer to the podium, standing guard like a sentinel. His jaw was clenched, but he kept his position, letting Hazel speak her truth. "How many weekends did you visit, Dad?" Hazel asked directly. "In the first year after you left, how many times did you show up?" Preston started to speak, but she cut him off. 3 times. You came 3 times in 12 months, and one of those was just to pick up your golf clubs from the garage." My mother reached over and took my hand. I hadn't realized I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. "Should I tell them about my 13th birthday?" Hazel continued. "The one where you promised to take me to 6 Flags, just the 2 of us? I waited on the porch for 4 hours. Mom kept trying to get me to come inside, but I was sure you were just stuck in traffic. You were in Cabo with wife number 2. You posted the pictures on Facebook while I was still sitting on that porch." "People make mistakes," Preston tried to interject, his voice weaker now. "Mistakes?" Hazel's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "Was it a mistake when you didn't come to my high school graduation because you had a golf tournament? Was it a mistake when you missed my college acceptance celebration because Stephanie's divorce wasn't final yet, and you didn't want to make things awkward with your new girlfriend?" The church was absolutely silent except for a few sniffles from guests who were crying. Even the children in attendance seemed to understand this was a moment that demanded quiet respect. "But Mom," Hazel's voice softened as she looked at me. "Mom sold her jewelry to pay for my prom dress. She worked 3 jobs so I could go to nursing school without loans. She drove a 15-year-old Honda that broke down every winter while making sure I had reliable transportation for my clinical rotations. She never dated because she said raising me was her only priority. She never said a single bad word about you, Dad, even when I could see in her eyes how much you'd broken her heart. So before you stand there and call my mother a disgrace," Hazel said, her voice rising with conviction, "before you accuse her of parental alienation, before you try to rewrite history to make yourself the victim, I have one question for you, Dad. Where were you? Where were you for 15 years while she was being both mother and father to me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Preston's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The alcohol-fueled confidence that had propelled him into the church was evaporating under his daughter's unwavering gaze. But Hazel wasn't finished. She had 15 years of truth to deliver, and she was going to make sure everyone heard it. "But wait, there's more," Hazel said, her voice taking on an edge that made me shiver. "Everyone here deserves to know about the last time I saw my father." 3 years ago, Dad reached out saying he wanted to reconnect. He said he'd been going to therapy, that he understood how much he'd hurt me, that he wanted to make amends. Preston's face went from pale to ashen. "Hazel, please don't." "I was so happy," she continued, ignoring his plea. "I thought finally, after all these years, I was going to get my dad back." I drove 2 hours to meet him at a restaurant in the city. I even bought a new dress for the occasion because I wanted to look nice for our fresh start. Brinley had backed away from Preston now, her eyes wide with what looked like dawning realization. We sat down, ordered coffee, and for about 5 minutes, I actually believed things were going to be different. Then he pulled out a folder, a legal folder. My father, who I hadn't seen in 2 years at that point, wanted me to sign an affidavit saying that my mother had systematically turned me against him throughout my childhood. Gasps echoed through the church. Willa covered her mouth with her hand. Even the priest looked shocked. "He wanted to sue you, Mom," Hazel said, looking directly at me, "for emotional damages and parental alienation. His lawyer had told him that if he could get me to testify that you'd poisoned me against him, he could potentially get a settlement of $500,000, $500,000 from a woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise me alone." "That's not how it was," Preston shouted desperately. "I wanted a relationship with you. The lawsuit was just to prove that your mother had wronged me too. You said, and I'm quoting word for word because I'll never forget it," Hazel's voice was ice cold now, "that if I really loved you, I'd help you get what you deserved, that Mom had probably saved plenty of money over the years by keeping you away, and it was only fair that you got your share." "Oh my God," someone whispered in the back. "When I refused, when I told you that Mom had never once badmouthed you despite everything, do you remember what you said then, Dad?" Preston was backing toward the door now, but Colton and Derek blocked his path. "You said I was just like her. Selfish, manipulative, a disappointment. You said you'd wasted your time trying to reconnect with someone so brainwashed. Then you left me sitting there in that restaurant crying into my cold coffee and blocked my number before I even got to my car." Hazel pulled out her phone and held it up. "I have the text you sent me that night from your lawyer's phone. Your lack of cooperation in this matter shows that you're not interested in a genuine relationship with your father. He will no longer be attempting contact. Any further communication should go through legal channels." The projection screen behind the altar, meant for hymn lyrics, suddenly displayed the text message. Ashton's cousin, who ran tech for the church, had connected Hazel's phone without anyone asking. There it was in black and white, the final rejection from a father who only saw his daughter as a potential payday. "So no, Dad," Hazel said, setting down her phone. "You don't get to walk me down this aisle. You don't get to play the victim. You don't get to stand in this church in front of my friends and family and pretend that my mother is the villain in your story." She stepped away from the podium and walked straight to me, taking my hands in hers. "This woman," she announced to the room, "is the only parent I've ever truly had. She didn't just raise me. She showed me what unconditional love looks like. She taught me that family isn't about DNA or titles or rights. It's about showing up, especially when it's hard, especially when you're tired, especially when you have nothing left to give." "Security!" Jerome called out, and 2 uniformed officers entered through the side door. "Please remove this man from the premises." As the officers approached, Preston made one last desperate attempt. "Hazel, I'm your father. This is wrong. You can't just erase me." Hazel turned to face him one final time. "I'm not erasing you, Dad. You erased yourself. Every missed birthday, every broken promise, every milestone you chose to skip. You wrote yourself out of my story. Mom just made sure I still had a story worth telling." The entire congregation rose to their feet as security escorted Preston and Brinley out, their applause drowning out his final protests about lawsuits and parental rights. The church doors closed behind Preston with a definitive thud that seemed to echo through my entire life. For a moment, nobody moved. Then my mother, 71 years old and typically reserved, stood up and began clapping. The sound rang out alone for exactly 2 seconds before Jerome joined her, then Willa, then Ashton's entire family. Within moments, all 200 guests were on their feet, applauding not for a performance, but for truth finally spoken aloud. Hazel walked back to me, mascara streaking her cheeks in dark rivers, her carefully styled hair coming loose from its pins. She looked absolutely beautiful. "Ready to try this again, Mom?" she asked, linking her arm through mine. "Are you sure you want to continue?" I whispered. "We could take a break, fix your makeup, give you a moment to breathe." "No," she said firmly. "He's taken enough from us. He doesn't get to take this, too." The organist, bless her heart, began playing Pachelbel's canon from the beginning. This time, as we walked down the aisle, people weren't just watching a bride approach her groom. They were witnessing something deeper. Every step felt like a victory lap for the two of us. For every night she'd cried herself to sleep, for every double shift I'd worked, for every sacrifice that had led to this moment. When we reached the altar, Pastor Michael asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" "I do," I said, my voice strong and clear. "Her mother, who was privileged to raise her and loves her beyond measure." The ceremony was beautiful. Ashton's vows included a promise not just to Hazel, but to our entire family, acknowledging that marrying her meant accepting our story, our struggles, and our strength. When they kissed as husband and wife, the cheer that went up could probably be heard 3 blocks away. The reception started with Jerome approaching me at the head table. "Verena, I need to say something. Any man who would abandon a daughter like Hazel and a woman like you is a fool. But his loss has been our gain. Hazel makes my son better every single day, and that's because of how you raised her." During the traditional father-daughter dance, something extraordinary happened. Hazel had chosen to dance with Jerome, who'd become a father figure to her over the years. But halfway through My Girl by the Temptations, she stopped the music. "Excuse me, everyone," she said into the microphone. "I want to change this tradition. Instead of a father-daughter dance, I want to dance with the person who taught me everything about love, strength, and perseverance. Mom, would you join me?" I couldn't see through my tears as I made my way to the dance floor. The DJ switched to 1,000 Years by Christina Perri, and as we swayed together, Hazel whispered in my ear, "Mom, I have something to tell you. Ashton and I are pregnant, 8 weeks, and if it's a girl, we want to name her Verena Grace, after the strongest woman we know." I pulled back to look at her face, searching to make sure I'd heard correctly. She nodded, fresh tears mixing with her smile, and we both started laughing and crying at the same time. The photographer captured that moment, and it remains my favorite photo from the entire wedding. The next morning, I woke up to 47 text messages. The video of Hazel's speech had gone viral overnight. Someone's cousin had posted it on social media with the caption, "Bride destroys deadbeat dad who crashed her wedding," and it had already been shared 12,000 times. Messages poured in from strangers saying Hazel had inspired them, that her words had given them strength to stand up to their own toxic family members. 2 weeks later, Preston's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter, threatening to sue for defamation and emotional distress. Hazel framed it and hung it in their apartment bathroom. "Every morning when I brush my teeth, I can remember that speaking the truth makes cowards threaten lawsuits," she told me. "It's been 2 years now since that wedding day. Little Verena Grace is 14 months old, toddling around my living room as I write this, reaching for everything she shouldn't touch and laughing when I redirect her. Preston has never met his granddaughter. He's never even asked. Brinley divorced him 6 months after the wedding, citing emotional abuse and alcoholism in the filing. Sometimes Hazel asks me if I think she was too harsh, if she should have handled it differently. I tell her the same thing every time. You spoke your truth with more grace than he deserved. You stood up not just for yourself, but for every child who's ever been abandoned by a parent who should have loved them better." The thing about single parenthood that nobody tells you is that your children see everything. They see you cry in the bathroom when you think they're asleep. They see you skip meals so they can eat. They see you pretend not to be tired when they need help with homework after your 3rd straight shift. But more importantly, they see you show up anyway. They see you choose them over and over again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If you're watching this and you're a single parent feeling like you're not enough, let me tell you something. You are. You're more than enough. Your love, your sacrifice, your presence, it matters more than any absence ever could. And if you're watching this as someone who's been abandoned by a parent, know this: their leaving says nothing about your worth and everything about their character. You deserve to be chosen, to be celebrated, to be walked down whatever aisle life presents to you by people who actually showed up for the journey. Family isn't about blood or DNA or legal rights. It's about presence. It's about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's about love that doesn't keep score or demand payment. It's about showing up, especially when it's hard. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with chosen family or the people who showed up for you when others didn't. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real, raw stories about families, love, and the truth that sets us free. Remember, you are enough. You've always been enough. And sometimes, the family you build through choice and sacrifice is stronger than the one you're born into could ever be.